Welcome everybody. So my name is Peter Neary. I'm the president this year of the Royal Economic Society. It's a huge pleasure and a huge honour to welcome you all to this event. The main event, at least that one in terms of time, is of course the annual lecture. We'll come to that very soon. But first we have a very important event taking place separately, which is the presentation of awards to the prize winners of this year's essay competition. I'm going to ask Andrew Cheshire, Professor at University College London, who's past president of the Royal Economic Society, to do the honours on this occasion.
Thanks very much. Well, so every year we have a Young Economist of the Year competition, which requires students to write essays on topics that we set, difficult topics. It's my pleasure to present the prizes to the winners this year. First of all, joining me on the judging panel were Professor Jonathan Haskell of Imperial College and Bridget Rosewell of Volterra. I want to thank them for their efforts, and Ashley Late of the Economics Network for organising the competition, and the team at Tutor to You for reading some thousands of essays and shortlisting for us. We didn't actually read these thousands of essays all ourselves. We considered a short list of 10 entries and selected 2 joint winners, and they're here today, and they're going to come up here, and then I'm going to say something about their work and them, but mostly about their work, and present them with a certificate. And then there'll be a further final presentation. I'll try and keep this brief. So the 2 joint winners are Louise Averill and Matthew Thorne. Would you like to join me up here? Thank you very much. Congratulations to you both. You'll both receive a prize, which will be revealed shortly, and a certificate, which I'll give you shortly. In alphabetical order, the first person I'll talk about is Louise Averill. Louise is at King Edward's 6th School at Stratford-upon-Avon. Congratulations. Louise wrote on the topic, "If you don't look after your health, you can't expect free access to healthcare. Is this wrong? What are the economic arguments?" And Louise wrote an essay that used the economics arguments throughout, and we thought that was very important. She looked at cost data, discussed the impact of early deaths on health service costs, and discussed questions of whether some health conditions, such as obesity, may be due to behaviours or inherited conditions, and so forth. A fine essay. And the other joint winner, we normally have a first and a second, but we couldn't distinguish which was the best here. So we have 2 joint winners. Matthew Thorne. Matthew was at King's College Taunton and is now studying at Cambridge University. Congratulations, Matthew. Matthew wrote on the topic, very topical. A recent UK tribunal case has found that Uber drivers are not self-employed and should be paid the minimum wage and holiday pay. Is this to the advantage of actual and potential drivers or not? And the judges liked the fact that he took a contentious topic where the economic literature has not yet reached a consensus, and he made good use of economic concepts and introduced an analysis of whether minimum wages would affect driver quality by mapping out the payoffs to the choice of high or low effort, and ended up suggesting the use of a new form of labour contract. Both very impressive pieces of work. Congratulations. Look forward to reading further work once you've completed your studies in economics. Congratulations to you both, and let me now give you these certificates. I'd like you just to remain here just for 1 minute while the President of the Royal Economic Society presents you with the real prize.
So this is for you. Congratulations. And this is for you. Andrew? I'll leave it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Andrew, and congratulations again to our winners for 2017. So now it is time for the 2017 annual public lecture of the Royal Economic Society, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Steve Machin from the London School of Economics. Steve is going to present the lecture on the economics of crime. Why commit crime? Economics incentives for criminal behaviour. If this were a purely academic audience, I would give you a long list of Steve's achievements. I talk about his tenure as a professor, many years at University College London and at LSE since 2016, I think. I talk about his many publications and the many citations they've generated. I talk about his service in terms of committees within the profession and indeed in the public sphere as well. But I'm not going to do that so much, because at the end of the day, you are sort of tentatively thinking perhaps about studying economics, maybe going to do it. You want to be persuaded that this guy is doing interesting work and that it's worth your while being here. And the answer is yes, he is, and yes, it is. He's a remarkable economist. He's started as a labour economist, I suppose, worked on traditional topics, but has branched out into an enormous range of issues. He's worked on labour, he's worked on economics of education. More recently, as in today's lecture, he's got interested in the economics of crime, covering a wide range of topics from riots on the streets to drug dealing on the web. So he has at all stages shown just how exciting and how important economics is, how the tools that have been developed over centuries can be applied to all sorts of questions and turn up interesting and, from a policy point of view, important lessons, as well as being exciting intellectual achievements in themselves. So it's going to be a great lecture. I should add that he's a great presenter. We've got a terrific hour ahead of us, so let's get on with it. Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I'm not sure I can live up to that, but we'll have to see. So I'm delighted to give this year's Royal Economic Society lecture. I think it's a great opportunity to try and highlight some of the things that have been going on more recently in the economics of crime research field. So just in terms of what I'm really going to talk about, you may say, what's an economist doing studying crime? Shouldn't that be a sociologist or a criminologist or perhaps a social historian? And what's an economist going to be looking at crime for? So I hope that one thing that you'll take away from this lecture, if it's the only thing that you take away, is that actually this is an area that's actually prime for economists to research upon. You know, it's not just when somebody asks you what you do and you say you're an economist, and they ask you what shares you should be investing in, perhaps, or whether you can forecast what's going to happen to GDP tomorrow by means of some kind of dodgy model of some sort. I actually hope you take the opportunity to see the way that fairly standard economics can be applied to thinking about social problems and in particular crime in this instance. And so that's the kind of motivation for one of the reasons why I want to try and talk about the kind of up-to-date research that's been going on in the economics of crime field. Okay, so now on to the subject matter of the actual lecture. So the kind of, by means of introduction, I think it's the case that for several reasons that I'll talk about as I go through the lecture. The economics of crime has become a thriving research area in the recent past, although you can trace back why economists might be interested in crime a long way, a long way back in historical terms. But what I'm kind of interested in here, as I'm an empirical economist, as Peter said, the origins of what I started working on was labour economics, and I think you'll see why it's a natural step for a labour economist to looking at issues to do with the economics of crime. And so what I want to talk about is the way we can model crime as economists and think about deriving testable implications that we can actually confront with data and hopefully representative large-scale data such that we can draw reasonably robust conclusions from that. And what I would say a little bit more formally than I did in the kind of opening spiel is actually crime research is a very important area for economists. If you actually try and calculate, as the Home Office does fairly frequently, what the economic and social costs of crime are, they're actually very high. It's not just what might be stolen in monetary terms. It's also issues to do with the psychological costs associated with victims. It's also in terms of funding, the way in which funding is taking place right through the whole of the criminal justice system. So if somebody's arrested, taken to court, maybe ending up in prison, that actually costs a lot of money. And so the economic and social costs of crime are actually very high. And that gives a good reason for thinking about why we might be able to design economic policies and public policies in general to try and think about combating crime, hopefully in a kind of economically efficient way. The research area itself is one that's very typical, I think, of what's been going on in applied microeconomics in the economics profession. It's one where a lot of the recent developments try and set up coherent research designs with the intention of trying to unpack causal relationships between factors that may be the determinants of crime, to say actually that something may cause crime to be higher or cause crime to be lower. And I'll talk a little bit about the way in which modelling approaches can be implemented to try and ensure that direction of causality. Not just correlation, talk about causality in terms of these kinds of relationships. So there's a lot of questions that an economist who may be interested in the economics of crime might feel are relevant. Some of them are here. So who commits crimes? What types of individuals, or what types of groups of individuals, or perhaps what types of organizations might commit crime, and for what reasons? A particular thing I want to focus on here, you've already seen this in the title of the talk, is whether if economic incentives facing individuals or economic agents more generally change, does that alter people's propensities to participate in crime? Might that shift somebody who's on the margins of committing a crime over that margin such that they do commit crime? And so obviously you can think about one of those being labour market incentives. If wages deteriorate in the labour market, or if unemployment goes up and you face a higher probability of becoming unemployed, does that make you turn to crime? Because the economic incentives for work have changed, for example. I'm also interested in how aspects of the criminal justice system, the law enforcement agencies, whether you have tougher, harsher or less harsh sentencing, whether they have scope to affect criminal behaviour. And I guess one of the more general aims of thinking about the whole research area rather than just particular studies is to think about what the role of public policy may be in terms of potentially deterring crime. So that's kind of what I want to talk about in terms of a general introduction. The actual lecture itself, I'm going to just start with the basic economic framework that economists have developed to think about crime choices. And then I want to present some evidence from some of this more recent research on the determinants of criminality. As I said before, with a particular focus on how economic incentives matter for crime. So I'm going to look at 5 areas of evidence. There's some of the areas that I've worked on, and I'm going to look at these 5 areas that I've put up here. So the relationship between crime and policing, the relationship between crime and sentencing, and I'm going to place that in the particular context of the riots that took place in London in August of 2011. I'll talk about crime and education. I'll talk about economic returns to crime, and I'll talk about some work we've been doing recently on hate crime incidents. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. So I'm going to start by just laying out, in a fairly general way, the way in which economists have developed a framework to think about how particular individuals facing different circumstances may be more or less likely to participate in criminal behaviour. Okay, so the basic economic models of crime typically begin with some kind of notion that people weigh up the expected benefits and the expected costs of engaging in criminal activity as compared to engaging in some other alternative activity at the same time. The usual one would be participating in legal activities, i.e. work. So the usual way in which people would set up this kind of choice would be between crime on the one hand, work on the other hand. You can obviously develop this in a more sophisticated way and thinking about people having a certain amount of time that they could allocate to both of these. But it's kind of easy just to think about it in terms of just the simple choice between crime on the one hand and work on the other hand. And the way in which economists tend to think about this is to think about expected utility. So the utility you get from doing crime or the utility you get from doing work, and it's expected utility because it's going to be a choice that arises under uncertainty. because there is an uncertain dimension to this choice between these two things, because there's a probability that you get caught if you're going to engage in crime. If you can obviously get a certainty equivalent wage in the labour market. On the other hand, if you participate in crime, there's going to be a non-zero probability that you're going to get caught, and so you're going to want to weigh up this choice under uncertainty between these two elements. So the classic reference, the classic formalization of this idea was done by Gary Becker in 1968 in his book Crime and Punishment, and Isaac Ehrlich developed various similar approaches to thinking about crime. He did much more on the kind of general time allocation. So there's a very interesting quote in Gary Becker's Nobel Prize lecture that he gave. So I'll read it out. He said, "I began to think about crime in the 1960s after driving to Columbia University for an oral examination of a student in economic theory. I was late and had to decide quickly whether to put the car in a parking lot or risk getting a ticket for parking illegally on the street. I calculated the likelihood of getting a ticket, the size of a penalty, and the cost of putting the car in a lot. I decided it paid to take the risk and parked on the street. In brackets, I did not get a ticket." So this is the kind of general essence of the way in which the model would work. You know, you kind of weigh up the expected benefit from doing this, factoring in a probability you're going to get caught. You have a certainty equivalent if had he paid for the ticket in a parking lot, and you would weigh up the two. And people on the margins may well be tilted one way or the other, depending on whether these variables that I'm talking about in this decision-making process change. And that's the kind of basic idea that we're going to think about when we turn to the empirical work. What happens when some of these potential determinants of crime change? So just to be a little bit more formal, so this is termed by some people as the rational model of crime. Gary Becker is actually one of the most quoted authors in sociology, not because he's quoted in an admired way, but he's criticized very much for offering the rational model of crime. It's worth, I think, saying that you can actually trace back these arguments. A long way you can trace them back to Jeremy Bentham, who made many of these arguments. Jeremy Bentham did a lot of work on prisons, actually, on designing prisons and thinking about criminality. The Panopticon prison was designed by Bentham, for example. This is really an as-if model, as if you were rational. I mean, you can't necessarily be rational because you don't necessarily know exactly what this probability is that you're trying to calculate. Okay, so that's why it's going to be an expected utility. So just in terms of formal maths here, we've got a utility that you get, U, if you participate in crime, and let's say that you get WC for participating in crime. If you get caught, there's a sanction for being caught, let's call that S, and you get a utility or a disutility from that. That's why there's a minus sign in front of that. And P would be the probability of being caught. So if P was equal to 0, you'd just get U of WC. If there was no police on the streets, and you knew there was no police on the streets, then you would just get U of WC. But that's not true because there is a non-zero probability. There's a chance you get caught. So your expected utility from participating in crime is going to be this term EU that we've got up there. Maybe that's not very good notation these days, EU, given what's going on, but maybe not. I don't know. If we have legal wages, W, then obviously you can get a certainty equivalent utility from your U of W here. And so you're going to commit a crime, everything held constant, if the left-hand side of that inequality here, the expected utility or the expected benefits from crime outweigh the certainty equivalent wage from working in the labour market. Okay, so there's a few things about this model. There's a couple of things that are very clear from this. First thing, of course, because there's a non-zero probability of being caught, crime needs to pay more than working. So WC needs to be above W. Otherwise, you wouldn't work. W might be the minimum wage, for example. So you might be trying to work out whether WC is above the minimum wage. It's also true that as P gets bigger, the probability that you're going to get caught, that gap between WC and W needs to rise as well. Okay, because there's a higher chance of being caught. Now, there are some, as with many economic models, there are actually some various nuances that make this rather difficult. So one of the previous presenters of the annual lecture, Nick Stern, Lord Stern, actually has written some papers about this model, actually criticising some of it as well, and having a bit of a go at some of the Chicago economists who set it up. It's the insights that I want to talk about here. That come out of it. And one is that crime needs to pay more than working. The second is the factors that shape crime participation are all related to one another. So there's the criminal versus legitimate earnings distinction, WC versus W. There's the probability of being caught, P, and there's the size of the punishment, or if you like, the sanction that the criminal justice authorities can impose on you if you get caught. So that might be a fine if you go to court. It might be being sent to jail, or something in between those two. It might be being let off with a caution, but there's something in between those kind of ranges. So what we're sort of going to be interested in this model that's talking about the marginal individual, somebody who's on the margins of participating in crime or work. We're going to think about what happens when some of these variables change. Okay. Now you can take this a little bit further. You can also factor in some other things that we might be interested in. So the title of the lecture was Who Commits Crimes? We might be interested in particular individual characteristics. Okay? And so we can factor them in. One very easy way to do it is to let that earnings W, the certainty equivalent to earnings, depend on characteristics like education, for example, or age, or gender, or immigrant status, for example. There's work out there looking at crime and immigration that takes this exact kind of approach. I'm not going to talk about it today, but there's work out there on that. And so we can also bring in factors that individual characteristics into this model. And the easiest way to do that is to figure it out that through different earnings power that individuals of different characteristics have. So, for example, people who've got more education tend to have higher wages, so all things held constant, that would predict that more educated individuals should be doing less crime. On the other hand, the life cycle profile of earnings, age earnings profiles tend to slope up, right, certainly until people get to their 50s, then they might start dipping down when skill obsolescence sets in. So, of course, that would predict that younger people are more likely to participate in crime. And so one thing we actually know from the data, of course, crime is typically the domain of young men. Crime age profiles tend to peak, depends on which crimes you look at, but crime age profiles tend to peak at about age 18 or 19. They have a kind of inverse U shape. And so we can kind of pull this kind of thing out of the model. We can also factor in other characteristics of the criminal justice system in this kind of way. We could make the probability of being caught perhaps depend on the number of police, or on police visibility maybe. And so we can introduce police into it, or we could let the sanction depend on sentence lengths that judges give. And so we can obviously bring in these factors as well and then get predictions about changes in sentence length, changes in number of police, and so on, and give a prediction about their likely impact on crime if they change. Okay, so just in a very generic kind of way, this just restates what I've just said, but kind of talks about things under different headings. So we can split those three terms in that inequality up into issues to do with the economic returns to crime. And the sort of things we think would be relevant there would be what potential criminal earnings are. If we think about crime as an occupational choice, we can think about criminal earnings coming from that occupation. We can think about the value of the loot that's out there to steal, perhaps. So if stuff gets more valuable or less valuable, perhaps criminals might substitute in terms of what they might steal or burgle a house or whatever. And so we might think about if the value of things change, that will alter and perhaps shift the economic returns to crime. We can also think about a response that either individual people might make to this, or perhaps governments might make in terms of security responses. And so it might be a security response that could alter the economic returns to crime. So one classic example of that was when the EU mandated that engine immobilizers had to be put into cars of a given vintage. And so what happened to vehicle crime after the engine immobilizers were put into cars? It actually plummeted massively because criminals clearly moved away from vehicle crime and moved to something else. Although as an interesting aside, what seems to have happened more recently is actually that criminals or potential car thieves have actually managed to get a technology of their own. And so apparently these days there's a little credit card size thing, but if you put on the side of a car, it demobilizes the engine immobilizer. So this kind of tells you about the dynamics of crime that might be related to technological change going on in various sorts of ways as well. And then there's the idea about criminal careers. If people might start to do crime and they don't invest in education or human capital, and they may therefore not have enough education or human capital to get a job, and therefore may be forced down a criminal career route rather than a formal labour market route. We can make similar arguments about policing and sentencing here, and then over here we have the kind of more certainty equivalent measures, but if the labour market's better, if education rates are higher, if there's better careers on offer, that people might be less likely to participate in crime. So the job careers thing is quite interesting, given the essay on Uber drivers, where there's very little career progression, it seems, unless the kind of reforms that you were talking about might be introduced, were built into that. Anyway, okay. So you can extend this in various ways, and I'm just going to talk very quickly about this, and then I'm going to go on to the empirical examples that I want to highlight. So you can obviously have a more general time allocation model if you want. You can think about people allocating time between crime, work, and leisure. And you could think about them doing that at different points in the day, different points in the week, different points in the year, whatever you think about. But the same sort of logic would go through on this. But actually, at any point in time, you would choose the activity to participate in which has the highest marginal return. So by that, I mean having the expected benefits above the expected costs in that setting. This model so far is, I haven't really stated this explicitly, but I will do now, is really about individuals on the margins of crime. But we know various forms of crime are not just done by individuals, they're done by groups of individuals or networks. So you could possibly expand the possibility of crime into crime networks if you wanted to. And that features in some of the newer areas of behavioral economics that have been done. Social networks and networks in crime may well be big things in the kind of more recent behavioral economics work. And then what I've already mentioned before, you can actually sort of think about crime dynamics. I've pitched this model as a static model at a point in time where people will make some kind of choice. You can actually build it up into a more dynamic model if you want to think about things about multiple offenders, career criminals, prolific offenders, who actually may be thinking about choosing criminal capital, choosing to build up their stock of criminal capital as compared to building up human capital. And so if criminal capital and human capital are substitutes, you know, you do one or the other, then you may well think that people may get stuck into a life of crime if they neglect the human capital side of things as well. Okay. So one thing, just before I turn to the empirical work, one thing that's absolutely vital here is I've tried to be careful to not saying anything about one thing causing another at the moment. But the causality question is actually central to many of these discussions about the economic model of crime. So the question of what causes what is extremely important in this. So let's take a concrete example. The model would say that more police should reduce crime. If you increase the number of police, that raises the probability that you'll get caught, and that should reduce criminal behaviour. On the other hand, it might be that high crime causes more police. One of the things that we'll see in the real world, which I'll talk about in a moment, and I'll show you some numbers on, is actually that more police are deployed in high crime areas. So actually that would say that causality goes the other way. Okay? On the education example, we might say, does higher education reduce crime? Or actually, does the expectation of a life of crime mean that you don't bother getting any education, and so therefore the crime causes the education rather than the education causes the crime? Okay, so this is a central question to generating what we might think of as plausible or coherent empirical work in this research area. So let's take the police example. I just said this a moment ago. In the Becker model, increasing the number of police reduces crime. But in the real world, more police are deployed where crime is high. So the next slide I'm going to show you just shows you that with some actual data. If you take data on the number of police per 100,000 population on this axis, and the number of crimes per 100,000 people on this axis, and the number of police per 100,000 full-time equivalent police per 100,000 population on this axis. This is the 43 police force areas of England and Wales in 2015. And the size of these circles depends on the size of the population in the police force areas. So actually, you get this upward sloping relationship. So this is a regression line, a statistical regression line that's fit through these, best fit through these 43 points. And so you get this upward sloping relationship, which of course, if you took it at face value, you would say, well, actually, there isn't a crime-reducing effect of police. Actually, there's a positive relationship between them. Where police is higher, crime is higher, and vice versa. So, of course, this circle up here is London, Metropolitan Police Service, where, of course, you have higher crime and you have higher numbers of police. Okay. So, what can you do about this? So producing credible empirical evidence obviously requires that this be addressed. It is true, but out there in the literature, there's some literature reviews that have been done, which have actually said there's no evidence that police reduce crime because of these kinds of correlations. It seems that really you need to think a little bit more about it than just looking at those kind of correlations and reaching a causal relationship, or inferring there's a causal relationship between the two. So one of the two key features, so looking at causality has actually been taking causality seriously and thinking about it in terms of what the model predicts has actually been one of two key features of the recent upsurge in the economics of crime research. So one, as I just said, is implementing research designs that try to establish the direction of causality from one or the other of the variables. The second thing is, and it's part and parcel of the same thing, is using large-scale, rich microdata, often on individuals, sometimes on very detailed areas, and natural experiments. I'll be very clear about what I mean by natural experiments, to try and unpack the direction of the causal relationship. Okay. So let me begin with. So I'm going to go now to the 5 areas, all of which try to varying degrees, try to deal with this kind of issue. Okay, so let's talk about crime and police here. So we have a nice car here. It's an economist patrol saying, can economic evidence, not police car, can economic evidence actually pin down the direction of causality in the crime-police relationship? So can we kind of do some detective work so we can actually figure out the way in which the direction of causality actually runs? So let me tell you about 2 ways in which people have tried to do this in the crime and police area. So I'm going to discuss 2 areas of evidence, one of which is the seminal paper by Steve Levitt. You may have read his book, For Economics. This is what he did before he started writing things like For Economics. But he has this very seminal paper in the US, which illustrates the way in which you can do this under certain assumptions, but is very, very clear about what those assumptions are, and to try and unpack the direction of causality in the relationship. So what he does, he notes that in election years in the US, cities tend to spend more on crime prevention. Okay? So you can actually predict that because they spend more on crime prevention in election years rather than non-election years, that you get bigger increases in police numbers in election years relative to non-election years. Okay? So that, in some sense, determines one aspect of the direction of causation, but actually, in election years, you've got police being higher, police numbers being higher, increases in police numbers being higher than in non-election years. Okay, so then he presents an analysis based on 59 big US cities who've got directly elected mayors using data on almost 59 US large cities from 1970 to 1992. Okay, then he carries out the kind of regression analysis, like this chart here. He gets his data on crime and police in most 59 US cities and looks at the relationship between them. So if he just does that kind of regression like I did with the England and Wales data, he gets exactly the same thing. He gets there's a positive relationship. The coefficient is 0.28. It's positive. There's an upward sloping relationship between crime and police in those US cities. The argument would be that in the US cities that have highest crime rates, that you have more police officers being deployed. Then he also looks at what happens to the number of police officers, the argument I just said a moment ago, the number of sworn police officers in those cities on whether there's an election year or not. And he gets the positive association that he said about. So there's more police officers are sworn in election and governor election years in his analysis. So he gets an upward sloping relationship between those. So a key empirical question then is what happens to crime in those election years? Is crime higher or lower in those election years? And it turns out that crime is lower in those election years. So he implements what's called in the business a 2-stage least squares estimator. But the first stage is showing that in election years you get higher numbers of police. The second stage is that actually crime is lower in those election years. And he finds a negative relationship and unpacks the direction of the relationship to be negative. So more police actually led to lower violent crime because under the assumption that the election years is the driver of police and not the driver of crime. The only way it operates is through affecting the number of police. He unpacks this negative relationship, which is much more in line with the standard economic model. Okay, so that's one example. So there's a newer literature, which I've participated in, which is based upon variations in police numbers that are induced by terrorist attacks. It's not by or from, one or the other, and in terrorist attacks. And so the idea, what happens after terror attacks would have taken place in various places, is that with these sharp discontinuities in police deployment, many more police get put on the streets after a terror attack. So you can also think about that as a first stage that occurs and generates an unexpected increase in the number of police. It offers, if you like, a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment such that there's more police on the streets because of a terror attack. Unexpected. So you can infer from this as well, from this kind of analysis, perhaps, and then see what happens to police, see what happens to crime after the terror attacks as well. So there's 3 papers that have looked at this. I should say, for anybody who's actually interested in reading any of these things, all the references are on the last slide of the talk, so, which I'm sure will be up on the website. So if anybody actually wants to read any of these things, then the actual papers are cited at the end. So there's 3 papers here. There's a nice paper about a terrorist attack on a synagogue in Buenos Aires that took place by Diteller and Shargodsky. So what happened, basically straight after the terrorist attack, police were deployed around the synagogue where the terror attack took place. So what they look at is, what they study is what happened to vehicle crime directly close to the synagogue before and after the terror attack, and then they figure out what happens when you go further away, such that there weren't more police deployed to see what happens. And they find that vehicle crime came down before and after the attack, relative to places further away where more police weren't deployed on the street. They don't actually have any data on police deployment, but that's the way they infer it. And so they basically look at what's called the reduced form and figure out that vehicle crime came down before and after, relative to places further away. The second paper is this paper about terror levels in Washington. They also don't have any data on police. They also don't have any data on whether a terror attack occurred, because it didn't in their time period. But basically, they have, all the government buildings in Washington have different colors to designate whether there's a chance of a terrorist attack. I presume red alert is probably the highest, and I don't know, yellow or something at the bottom. It's probably like a heat map. I don't actually know what the colors are. And so what they also look at, and they infer, they also don't have any data on police, but they infer that more police will be put on the streets when you're in the highest terror alert level as compared to the lowest. And they look at what happened to crime, and again, they find that crime came down when you move to a higher terror alert level. The paper we look at, the third paper here, this is a paper of mine with Mirko Dracker and Rob Witt. We look at what happened following the 7/7 terror attacks in July that took place in London in July 2005. And so what happened there was a very, very big increase in police presence in the areas of London, the London boroughs where the terror attack took place. Actually, overnight, the number of police deployed in terms of police hours went up by about 32% overnight. It stayed up for 6 weeks at that level and then went down after the 6 weeks. So the going down is actually quite interesting here. So we actually have 2 experiments here in some sense, 2 quasi-experiments. First, when the police were put on the streets. And you might say, well, that might not be quite so good because there might be a behavioural response from people. They may be, when they get on the tube or when they don't get on the tube, in fact, they may be exhibiting some behavioural response because they're concerned about the terror attack that took place the day before. So you might say that might happen. And so you might be a bit concerned about the cleanness, if you like, of the quasi-experiment. On the other hand, it stayed up for 6 weeks and then it went down, and nobody knew the police numbers were going down after 6 weeks. And so so what we could do in our analysis is we look at what happened to crime when more police were put on the streets. We will then also look at what happened to crime when the police were taken off the streets. We find a very strong relationship. So this is the kind of idea. So those are the 5 London boroughs where the attacks took place. So we kind of set them up as a treatment group. They're the ones that were affected by the terror attack. And then we can use the rest of London, outer London, as a control group. So in an ideal world, a bit like a medical experiment, mimicking a medical experiment, when you have a treatment group who take a pill and a placebo group who either don't take a pill or perhaps take a placebo pill that doesn't work. And so what we can do is we can say what happened to crime in the treatment areas before and after the terror attack relative to crime in the control areas, the outer London boroughs. So, of course, what we require is that nothing really happened in the outer London boroughs. And so this is what happened in terms of the police deployment in the treatment group, which is the purple, and the control group, the brown. This is the colours that the American Economic Review, where it's published, use, which are horrible colours, I think. I wouldn't choose them at all, but I wouldn't not want my paper in the American Economic Review on the basis of the colours of the chart, though. Anyway, so the red lines, the red vertical lines, are the 6-week period when the police were, when more police were on the streets of London, and the other red line here is the same 6 weeks in the previous year. Crime and indeed policing are very seasonal, and so you probably want to think about a comparison like that. So what happened basically was the number of police jumped up about 30%, stayed up and then came down after around about 6 weeks. And then actually they were very similar. Trends were very, very similar, both in the treatment group and control group afterwards. So the kind of question there is, of course, what happened to crime in those two time periods? So this is set up here in this table. This is just descriptives showing you in the left-hand panel here the police deployment numbers, and the right-hand panel the crime numbers. So you see that police deployment went up by, hours worked per 1,000 population went up by a huge 72 in the treatment group here, and it barely moved in the control group, which is outer London. Now, many people say they thought that the police were brought in from outer London to inner London, which is true. But what also happened was that police were brought in from the police forces just outside London into outer London as well, from the Essex Police, for example, or Surrey Police, or whatever. So actually, it stays very, very constant. So this just shows you, so you can actually, so again, the terminology used in the statistical work is to set this up as a difference in difference. So the one difference is what happened to police deployment in the treatment areas, the 5 London boroughs affected by the terrorist attack, before and after. And then the other difference is what happened in the controls, and you can take the difference in difference, which is this number here, 70, which if you do it in growth terms is a 35% increase in the number of police. So a huge increase in the number of police on the streets. So the key question then is what happened to crime? And this is done on the other side of the panel here. And so you can see that crime per 1,000 population came down by 0.44 in the treatment areas. It barely changed, fell by 0.02 in the control areas. And so you get a crime reduction of about 11%. Okay? So this enables us to pin down the relationship between crime and police. And you basically get, if you divide the one by the other, the minus 0.11 by the 0.35, you get an elasticity, the sensitivity of crime to police of about minus 0.3. So a 10% increase in the number of police led to a 3% fall in crime. So again, we get evidence of a negative causal relationship between crime and police. Okay. So these studies that take the question of causality more seriously. You can quibble about them in various ways if you want to. We do a lot of other things in this paper. For example, we look at crimes that are more susceptible to police visibility than other crimes. So, for example, most burglaries that take place at night aren't likely to be very sensitive to crime, to police being on the streets of central London. And you actually get no burglary effect at all. Shoplifting, various street-level crimes come down massively. Which, of course, are things that are more sensitive to police visibility. But I think the idea here is that taking the causality seriously, you can get something that's in line with the predictions of the core basic economic model. Okay, that's the first area I wanted to talk about. So the second area I want to talk about, the second piece of empirical evidence, is something about sentencing. So this is another area where the causality question here it arises. The causality problem in this setting is that actually sentencing, when sentencing is made harsher or more lenient, that's often determined by a prior trend in crime. Something about crime being really high in some areas might make government set mandatory sentencing or set sentencing guidelines to be tougher because of what's been going on in terms of crime. So again, you need something that shocks the sentencing that that was perhaps unexpected, that then you can see what happened to crime subsequently. Okay. So we have this paper where we study what you can sort of envisage ex post as a natural experiment in sentencing. So what happened after the London riots that took place in August 2011 was judges gave offenders much, much tougher sentences for exactly the same crimes that people might have undertaken 6 months before, and they were given much tougher sentences for just doing the same thing because it was part of the riots. Okay, so you might say, well, did this tougher sentencing have any deterrent effect by reducing crime subsequently? So the episode here, there's these quite nice maps. The episode here was that Mark Duggan was shot by the police in Tottenham Hale, over here, on, what was it, August the 4th, 2011. And then you got these riots spreading across London, and indeed the copycat riots that occurred in other parts of the country. We look at London. And so you can see it was very, very concentrated around the actual incident to start with. And then it diffused out, and you got these kind of, if you like, crime hotspots that occurred over the next few days. And then a huge number of police were put on the streets. A huge number of people were arrested, and it was stopped. Here's all the riot-related incidents, and you can see how it spreads to different areas. But it's very localized. Even within this. I'll show you the numbers. The lowest, it was 4,720 or 60 lower super output areas in London. It's only a small minority of them that had riot crimes taking place in those areas. So what happened was the sentences for the riots, people participating in the riots, were much tougher, both in magistrates' courts and in Crown courts. For people who were arrested for participating in the riots. Two things occurred. Many more people were placed into immediate custody. They were put in jail straight away. And the average custodial sentence awarded was much, much higher. So this column shows you the riots-related offences, and this shows you similar offences in the year before in magistrates' courts, and this does for Crown courts. Over here, and you can see they're much, much higher. But if you look at, for example, the average custodial sentence here was 6 months, 6.6 months, and here it was 2.5 months for all crimes. You can see you get a pattern across different crime types. That's very clear. So it's very clear. You can find lots of quotes from judges, and we've got lots of quotes from judges in our papers saying that they had handed out much, much tougher sentences for people participating in the riots. Even the girl who was arrested from where I come from, Wolverhampton, and she stole a pair of trainers, but it turned out they were both left-footed trainers, which are totally useless to her. She's still got a much tougher sentence for stealing the pair of trainers than somebody else would have done 6 months before. Maybe that's something about the West Midlands, I don't know. Who knows? Okay, I'm allowed to say that. Anyway, so the riots were very geographically concentrated. So this is a bit busy, this slide, sorry. But you can see this shows you this is all the 4,720, I think, isn't it? Is it 4,720? Yeah, no, 4,600, what's that? 80, 4,750. Lower super output areas, very, very small census areas in London. You can see there was 88 of them where the riot crimes took place. And so you can actually see from this down here that the crime rate went up massively in those areas and didn't really change at all in the other areas. This shows you a blipping up of the total crime rate over here. But the point is they were very geographically concentrated, and there were some riot areas and some non-riot areas. There were often, when the riots spread away from Tottenham Hale, of course they were concentrated in places where there's lots of shops, lots of retail stores, because people were going and stealing stuff. In fact, there was a lot in my esteemed colleague, ex-colleague, is from Croydon. There was a big deal in Croydon. That's right as well, yeah. That's right. Okay. Anyway, okay. So what happened to crime after the tougher sentences? So we established a first stage here, which showed you that the tougher sentences took place. So we get something that's really rather interesting here. The riot crimes were, there was particular sorts of crimes that were undertaken during the riots, and therefore they were the ones that got the tougher sentencing. Other crimes weren't riot crimes at all. So the big things that occurred were burglary, criminal damage, and violence against the person. Almost all of the sentences were for those categories. Okay? Then there was non-riot crimes, that go on at the same time, none of which really were featured in the courts disproportionately more after the riots took place. So this shows you what happened to crime in various time windows for the riot crimes and for the non-riot crimes. And you get a pretty interesting pattern, I think, which says something about criminal behavior. So you see that the riot crimes fell significantly over different time windows afterwards. These negative signs say that the crime is falling for the riot crimes. On the other hand, the non-riot crimes, actually crime goes up afterwards. So you see a deterrence effect on the riot crimes, but you don't see a deterrence effect on all crimes. You actually see a substitution away by probably quite rational criminals to not participate in the crimes where sentences were tougher, and actually to participate in crimes where the sentencing hadn't got tougher. And so you get this kind of very nuanced pattern about tougher sentencing. It doesn't mean that tougher sentencing is good and deters crimes. It seems like it actually substituted away. The criminals actually substituted in response to that action. Okay, and again, this is facilitated by being able to look at this first stage, which tells you about how the sentences had got tougher. Okay, so that's the conclusion that we reach in that paper. Again, seems very much in line with the idea that criminals behave in a kind of rational way in some dimension. Okay, let me turn to the third area I want to talk about, and that's a highly topical area about does more education reduce crime? So this is a very nice graphic from our LSE magazine Centerpiece, where you can see that the school bus is beating the corrections bus, the jail bus, down the street and winning the race. And so therefore education is reducing crime in this kind of way. Okay. So what about crime and education? So we've got various mechanisms we might think about here. There's the Becker model, where we think that if education raises wages, which it does, there's lots of evidence out there that people who've got more education earn more. You can obviously figure out from the Becker model that therefore education should reduce crime. There's other mechanisms actually you might think about that actually, if you think about a time availability, think about the time allocation model, while kids are in the classroom or in lectures about why commit crime, you're not doing crime. You're actually incapacitated in some way. You're incarcerated. It's like being in jail. And so, you can think that actually there might be an incapacitation effect that might operate. On the other hand, there's evidence out there from behavioral economics which argues that more people who've got higher levels of education have more patience in some sense. They're not straight out there for instant gratification. I don't know whether that's really true, actually, but that's what's hypothesized out there. And so therefore, if you're more patient, you'll build up your human capital, you'll get your earnings eventually when your life cycle earnings profiles slope upwards, and so you won't participate in crime. Of course, all of these, again, are subject to the theme I want to return to again, but it's a feature of this new work in the economics of crime field, establishing this direction of causation. Because if you know you're going to go into a life of crime, you probably don't need to get any education, and so therefore the relationship could go the other way. So again, we need some means whereby we can think about unraveling the direction of causation to flow from education to crime rather than the other way around. Okay, so this has been done in the literature by looking at, if you like, unintended consequences of education policies. Usually education policies that raise the compulsory school leaving age. Okay, so there's one of my papers where we looked at this when the compulsory school leaving age was raised in England and Wales in the 1972 to 73 school year. So for the cohort that's going to leave school in the summer of 1973, the compulsory school leaving age was raised from 15 to 16. There's another one that's been exploited in the literature, not to look at crime, but to look at other wages, actually, mostly. Wage effects of education. Back in 1947, it went up from 14 to 15. So basically, there's a group of people who had they been in the previous school year, would have dropped out, would have left school at age 15, but they have to stay in the classroom for another year. So you can compare what happens to, they obviously get one more year of education. So they're measured year of education, but as long as they don't truant for the whole year and not comply with the policy. But as long as everybody doesn't truant, some people will stay in the classroom for an extra year. And so they get some portion of an extra year of education. So the question would be, what happens to the crime rates of the second group compared to the first group? And so you can sort of set this up as, again, the lingo that's used here is there's a discontinuity set up here, and so you can look at what happens on either side of this discontinuity. So the birth cohort that's going to be affected by this is people who were born in 1957. So people who were born in 1957 would have to stay on to age 16. People who were born in 1956 could have left school at age 15. And so you can look at a window around those birth cohorts to see what happens. Okay, so we've got rich data to look at this. We've been able to match cohorts of individuals using data on the Offenders Index database matched to education levels from a general household survey over time. So this is what happens to the proportion of people who have no educational qualifications for those cohorts. So the vertical line here the vertical line denotes the cohorts that are affected. So to the right of the line, you're affected, you had to stay on to age 16. To the left of the line, you could have left school at age 15 if you wanted to. And so if you look at this, you see a big discontinuous jump, a big discontinuity for this group compared to this group. The lines are sloping down a bit because we know that people over time, for quite a long time, the proportion with no educational qualifications has been coming down. But basically, you can see what happens here. It's bobbling down, takes a big jump down, and then bobbles down a bit further. And so it seems like the policy did what you might expect it to do. It reduced the proportion of people with no educational qualifications. The other way of thinking about it is looking at the age of everybody, the average age at which people leave school. And so you can see here that there's a discontinuous jump in that as well. And so the key question here, it goes up, what, 0.4 of a year? This is for everybody leaving school. So you wouldn't expect to get by one here because there's some people who would have stayed on beyond the school leaving age before anyway. So it goes up about 0.4. So the key question here is what happened to crime? And so if you look at this, you also see a discontinuity in crime where crime drops as well for those cohorts. Crime is very cyclical, and so that's why it varies across the business cycle. And so you can see there's a kind of cycle here which sort of carries on afterwards, but you can see there's a significant drop in between. So you can actually infer here that it's a bit like doing that two-stage process before, two-stage least squares process before. You can actually figure out what the size of a crime reduction is, which is minus 0.08. That's that gap there. I already showed you that the age left school went up by about 0.4. It's actually 0.375. And so you can actually figure out what the relationship between crime and education is here, and it's minus 0.297. Okay? So basically, a 10% increase in education levels reduces crime by 2.97%, 3%. Okay, so we see a significant reduction in crime. Okay, so this seems to establish that causality runs from education to crime. There's other work that I've been involved with more recently with Brian Bell and one of my PhD students, Rui Costa, where we've been looking at US states. There's a lot more reforms in the US because these dropout age reforms vary across states, and so you can see states changing at different times. So we've got 29 dropout age reforms we look at in this discontinuity setting here. And again, this is exactly the same kind of setting that you've got to the right of the line, you've got the people who face the higher dropout age, and to the left of the line, you've got the people facing the lower dropout age. And again, you see exactly the same kind of relationship here. You see the proportion dropping out of high school without a high school diploma. So the high school dropout comes down, and there's a discontinuity here. And again, the same kind of thing for the crime on this time. Its arrest rates this time in the US, again, drops. So again, we seem to find out evidence of a causal impact, crime-reducing impact of education. Okay. Right, let me move to the next area, which is, I guess, the area that speaks most to the title of the talk, although I wanted to talk about many more things than that. If I got more time, I could ramble on about more as well, I guess, but, you know. Anyway, so the economic returns to crime. This, perhaps surprisingly, is quite an under-researched area, even though it's absolutely vital for thinking about the way in which economic incentives for criminals may alter their decisions. Economic incentives facing individuals may alter their propensity to participate in crime. Okay, so there is various surveys that have been taking place over time to try and get a handle on this. But the trouble is, it's all about self-report data, and it sort of asks people about how much income they made from crime over the last year. And so, you know, that's not really going to be the most reliable. There's pretty good incentives for people not necessarily to report that very accurately. It's a bit like To a lesser extent, it's a bit like getting earnings on self-employed individuals, but, you know, many of whom may be participating in some of these activities, I guess, but I don't know. Anyway, so we've got this relatively new paper that's coming out next year, where we actually try to look at this head on, and try and look at the relationship between crime and changing crime and changing prices of goods and commodities. Okay, so a kind of very anecdotal example with this little burglar guy here is, you know, what do burglars steal when they enter homes? So, you know, the old anecdote used to be back in the 1970s and 1980s that people would go and steal the VCR, the video recorder, go and sell it down the local pub or something and get some money. You know, these days, that doesn't seem to happen. The price of video recorders has fallen massively. They're not worth very much. On the other hand, the price of jewelry, for example, has gone up a lot over time. The price of gold and silver went up massively through the 2000s. And so we might think about, well, do these shifting prices of different goods alter the propensity to steal different stuff? Okay. So we very nicely, the Metropolitan Police Service gave us all their data, administrative monthly data between January 2002 and December 2012 on everything that was stolen in all thefts, robberies and burglaries over that time period. And so quite a lot of these are market goods. They're not all market goods, but quite a lot of them are market goods that we can actually look at what the price of the market goods are, and we can see how they change over time. So we can match the prices of goods to estimate crime price elasticity, the sensitivity of crime to changes in prices. So it's very clear that some crime types, the prices rise very rapidly, some fall very rapidly, both the prices and the crimes. And so the question is, are they connected in any obvious kind of way? Okay, so this is some numbers, and I'm highlighting two sorts of crimes here. The general trend in crime, in recorded crime, is down in London over this time period. So the solid black line here is the total number of the robberies, thefts, and burglaries we've got in our data. And you can see it drops down very rapidly in the first half of the decade and then flattens out. The other crime, which I'm going to focus on a little bit, it was very striking, which is metal crimes. So metal crimes actually went the other way. And metal crimes went up massively here, down here, and then massively up again in this time period. So what actually, if you can actually see the notes back there, we talk about 44 goods, which are consumer goods, and we've got 7 groups of metals: copper, lead, aluminium, gold, silver, brass, and other metal categories. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay. So here on the 44 product groups, these are the things that changed their crime share the most over time. This is probably very intuitive to people. It's exactly what you might expect is being stolen more over time. So let's take the things that are being stolen less. It's audio, CD players, DVDs and stuff, whose crime share falls to almost 0 by the end of the period. And the things that are being stolen at the top most are mobile phones, bikes, and you can also see there's various jewelry categories up there as well. And you know, if you just walk around London, you see all the fancy bikes. It's pretty obvious that people are paying a hell of a lot of money for some of the bikes that they're cycling around on these days, and so they're much more valuable than the old bikes that used to be around in the past. So, okay, so what's the relationship? Well, this is the relationship for the 44 goods. This axis shows you the change in crime. This shows you the change in prices over 12 months. And you see this upward sloping relationship between these things. And so you've got all the jewelry goods up here and the bikes up here, and you've got the audio visual equipment down here. So from this, we estimate quite a strong sensitivity of crime to prices in terms of changes. Now, the one worry with this, of course, is we're looking at prices for goods on sale in the shops, which is not the resale price. Now, we are looking at changes, but of course, that isn't the price. That isn't the value that a criminal is going to get for this, which will be a markdown in most cases, unless they can find some very gullible seller to pay even more than you pay in the shops. But to the extent that that resale price is constant over time, looking in changes is going to be okay. The other goods I want to focus on, the other crimes I want to focus on are the metal crimes, where we do have data. We have exact data from scrap metal dealers about how much scrap metal prices. And so we have the actual prices. So this became a big thing. I don't know whether you saw all this stuff in the newspapers. Most of these are from 2012. And these are some examples of the sorts of metal crimes being reported on in the newspapers. So there's the great one at the top. Who did a runner with Steve Ovet's statue? Somebody stole part of Steve Ovet's bronze statue from a park somewhere. But there's other much more serious things even than that here. So metal theft costs the Church of England £10 million a year. So this is lead being stolen off churches. Okay, this is lead being stolen off churches, and there's two consequences of this. A, it costs the Church of England quite a lot, and B, the insurance premium go up in response to this as well. There's an astonishing one here that over one weekend, Czech metal thieves dismantled 10-ton bridge. So the bridge just disappeared over a weekend, and then there's other things here you can see. This is a very sad one. This is a very sad one down here. So metal thieves target cages at animal hospital. So apparently there was aluminium cages that various injured animals were in at this animal hospital, and they stole the metal cages and threw the animals around, and various of them had to get put down. But the aluminium cages were valued at something like about £30,000. And that was how much it was worth. So, okay, so it's kind of an interesting question about why might metal crime have gone up. Okay, so we've got information on UK scrap metal prices, and it turns out that they very much track the world price for those metals, the world commodity price. So this just shows you two examples here, and you can almost not see the two separate lines on this. So the dotted lines here are the scrap metal price, and the solid lines are the world metal price, either the world, for the 7 composite metals we've got. Here is copper. And so you can see here the copper price and the scrap copper price in the UK of these things. And they really track each other. So really, these prices have been driven up by the world commodity price boom that took place in the 2000s, particularly from China. The copper price went up hugely. The copper price rises. This is indexed to 1. So the copper price is going up about 500% over this time period. And it's particularly the demand from China as China expanded. Now, to establish causality, it's pretty obvious, I think, that criminals in the UK, or potential criminals in the UK, are not driving up the copper price in China. Okay? So I think we can probably think about what happened to crime here as being driven by the prices running, the causality running from prices to crime. So the question is, what does the crime look like? And it's amazingly strong. So this is taking 12-month changes so that you can net out the seasonality of the crime data for all metals and focusing particularly on copper here. So the copper one's super interesting. The size of these elasticities are really big, 1.5 and 1.8, and they're really big, very, very strong correlation. But the startling thing really is that the way that the crime went up as the prices went up, but also came down as the prices came down as well, and then went back up again subsequently. So basically we find these very strong metal crime reactions to prices. And actually, if I just flick back to this first chart, of course, these are the only crimes really that are going up over this time period as well. So we see this big sensitivity of crime to prices, which we take as strong evidence that economic returns matter for engaging in crime. Okay, let me just talk. I've only got 2 or 3 minutes left. Let me talk about the last one, which is probably the weakest in terms of causality, but it's super interesting, I think. So hate crime has started to be studied now in various different dimensions, and this is much more in the mode of the behavioral economics aspects of crime. Now, these are crimes that have significant costs to victims, and they potentially have very significant costs to communities, where their divisive nature may well cause problems that accumulate over time. So we've started to look at we've got some very rich data kindly made available by Greater Manchester Police, where we've got very detailed information on the nature of hate crimes and where they occur. So what we're sort of interested in is how, in this piece of work, is whether terror attacks that take place in other parts of the world have an impact on local hate crime. So what we do is we study 10 terror attacks. Before, we were studying 8 in our first wave of this analysis, which is before the attack took place in Manchester. But now we've got Manchester in the data, and you'll see how very, very important that is for local hate crime here. We've got information from 2008 to 2017, and we've got these 10 incidents. So just by means of an example, this shows you what happened to hate crimes in Manchester in the 8 weeks before and after the Lee Rigby attack that took place in Woolwich in London on May the 22nd, 2013. And you get this big spike up I should say what the hate crimes are. They're anti-Muslim hate crimes in Manchester, Islamophobic hate crimes in Manchester. So you get this big spike up from basically nothing to 30. I mean, you know, these aren't massive numbers, but 30 in a week, over 30 in a week, if you think about what happened here. This is then the 10 crimes we've got here on the same scale. The reason for showing this is because the end here is the Manchester attack, where it goes up hugely. So we thought we'd better illustrate this one here. So this is this one here, which looks very striking there, but when put into the context of the Manchester one, looks rather small. But you can actually see a spike up around the date of all of these attacks taking place. So it's what is it? Lee Rigby, Charlie Hebdo, a Tunisia attack, the Paris Bataclan attack, Brussels, Nice, Berlin, then the Westminster, Manchester, and London Bridge attacks. Okay? And so you very clearly get an impact of these incidents taking place elsewhere on local hate crime in Manchester. So what we do here is we kind of, and the other observation is that they've contributed cumulatively such that hate crime is quite a lot higher at the end of a period than it was at the start. So it's been edging up each time. So the question is, one of the questions is about, I mean, we've got a paper almost finished on this now. But what we do here is we kind of think of this as a quasi-experiment, and you can see what happens to hate crimes before and after these terror attacks. And so basically you see this strong jumping up, which lasts for about 3 weeks afterwards. The final thing we do in this paper is we ask whether the media plays a role as a transmission mechanism in any of these hate crimes. And we do find some evidence that it tends to magnify. So if you look at this chart here, this is the example for Lee Rigby. The crimes go up, and then the number of newspaper articles covering them goes up, and you get a bounce back up again in the hate crimes afterwards. Not as much as on the day of the incident, this is daily. But you see a magnifying effect from the media. So not only are the attacks occurring locally, the local media and the national media are actually probably having an impact on magnifying them in some ways. Now, this may just be information transmission, but there still is having an impact in that kind of way. Okay, I know I've got to finish. Okay, so let me just conclude. So the empirical evidence I've presented here, I think, is in line with the notion that economic incentives do matter for crime. And this has become a central plank in the new developments in the economics of crime research field. There's a lot more to do. It's a great area for people who go to university after doing A-levels in economics to kind of study empirical analyses like this in terms of research, especially as new forms of crime opportunities are up. So, for example, one of the really quite interesting things we know very little about are the big increases in online crime activity. So we know that measured crime has been falling quite a lot, but until relatively recently, much of the online cybercrime numbers are not in there. So it's probably true that crime has not fallen as much as the recorded crime statistics tell you. And that's probably borne out by it is now being recorded by the police in the fraud categories. And there's actually quite a lot of cybercrime going on. So actually crime has not fallen by anywhere near as much as you might think from looking at the recorded crime statistics. So finally, the way in which criminals or potential criminals seem to respond to economic incentives, I've illustrated some of these examples, and I've also tried to point out that sometimes they stay one step in front of the authorities on this. The online crime stuff is very clear on that. Many police officers are not trained up. It's not in their skill set to be tracking down online crimes, and so it's a real big challenge, I think. So this does provide a significant challenge to law enforcement agencies and to public policy in combating crime. Okay, so I want to finish there. So there's all the references. Okay. Time for questions.
15 minutes for questions.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask.
And could I just remind people there is a hashtag. You can. We are in the Royal Institution in London, but it is possible to watch this from anywhere in the world. And if I can be reminded of the hashtag, it is. It's on the front lecture. It's on the front of the lecture. They will be beamed in to Romesh here, who will ask the questions.
Stand here. I was supposed to announce it at the start, but that was a crime I committed myself. Okay, who wants to ask questions? I can't see many people. Come. Oh, we've got a roving microphone. There's these two up front. Ah. There's one at the back there. Look, there's one right at the top.
Might be a good idea to take 2 or 3 at a time.
Yeah. Okay, should we let's take 2 or 3 at a time. There's definitely one.
Steve, just going back to the very first causal relationship you talked about, the effectively number of police on the street versus crime. I'm not clear, did it work in reverse? In other words, when, whatever it was, 30% of the police went away, we saw crime rise back up again.
Yeah.
And was there a time lag involved there? Or are we actually learning that, in effect, the criminal community are actually pretty sharp? You've clearly demonstrated they're pretty sharp about moving from one market to another market. Are their antennae suitably developed that they can spot the police disappearing and back they come? So that's 2 questions. Does the process in effect work in reverse, and does it work as quickly as it was demonstrated to work first stage round?
Okay, we're going to take 2 or 3 if anybody else wants to ask one.
Paul Hudson, retired academic. Thank you very much indeed for a most stimulating talk. I wanted to ask a question about crime in the financial world. There doesn't seem much attempt, as far as I can gather, by the banks to curb this. I'm thinking in particular, my strong impression, and it's confirmed by listening to Paul Lewis on his BBC Radio 4 programme, Moneybox, is that the amount of crime committed by hackers into bank accounts seems to be on the increase. Now, when I started my working life, well, it's less than 100 years ago in banking, the main form of transaction was using cheques. Now, there were frauds taking place. There was fraudulent activity and money was lost. But in proportion to what is going on now, it seems minimal. And I wonder why the banks don't try to switch back to using a more conventional system of transacting payments. It seems to me that they're quite happy, in fact, to install new technology. And as John Kay, who used to hold the Drummond chair at Oxford, now an investment banker, he thinks that the criminals, the hackers, will always be cleverer than the electronics experts in the banks. He's very pessimistic.
Tim Harford of the Financial Times. 2 very famous statistical studies of the causes of a fall in crime in the United States in the 1990s. One is this idea that lead was phased out of petrol and then everyone had less brain damage. And over time, that led to a sharp fall in crime. And another even more famous study carried out by John Donahoe and Steve Levitt, who you've mentioned, is that the legalization of abortion in the early 70s in the United States, wait 15, 20 years, fewer unwanted children, and therefore less crime. Both very interesting, both very controversial. How seriously should we take these studies?
So let me answer those 3 questions. So I obviously lost track of it when I was talking about the reaction after the terror attacks. So basically, the crime went up about 11%. So we went down about 11%. Almost the day after, stayed down about 11% and then went back up almost when the police were taken off the streets as well. Whereas other economic variables, like that you may well think would have been affected by the terror attacks, like travelling on the tube, for example, took a massive drop down, or travelling into central London at the weekend. Both of them took a big drop down straight away, and then they gradually adjusted back up and only reached their pre-attack levels by about Christmas. And so it clearly is what you said, that people seem to be reasonably savvy. It's also true on those crimes that are more visible or more susceptible to police visibility, but it bounced back up as well. The white-collar crime thing is one issue, and so is the issue about, I mean, cybersecurity is a real big business now for lots of companies, not just banks, and lots of other companies are being hacked into as well. We know we saw the WannaCry virus that had a massive impact on lots of companies across the world when that happened. I'd be very interested actually if people, because of course many of the young people in the room know much more about this than you or I do, I think, because they're much more savvy about the way that things work on the internet. So I'd be very interested if any of the young people have a view on what's going on in terms of cybercrime, which I think will become a very big, interesting research area for economists to look at in due course. The two studies, yeah. The lead, there's been lots more validations of the lead study, I think, and it does seem like that's pretty relevant. There's also stuff about various paints that were in various sorts of houses as well, which have toxic elements in them. And when people were growing up, that had a negative effect on them as well. So I think that one's fairly well established. We haven't got a British study on that, which is a shame. Somebody was going to try and use the ALSPAC data from Bristol to look at that, but I don't know whatever happened about that. The other paper is very controversial. I'm sure you know it's been very controversial. It's been pored over by many people about the timing of the abortion abortion legislation being introduced in different states at different times, and that's proven much less easy to validate that one, I think. So I'm not sure where we are on that one now, but I know there's been a lot of critical studies about that. Although, to be fair, it's pretty hard to think about what the exact timing would be, because the idea of a paper is that the potential criminals weren't born when the abortion legislation was introduced, whereas they would have been before. But it's pretty hard to work out exactly what the right age for the individuals to be doing the crime would be. So it's still a bit hazy about how you measure that. It's a kind of interesting idea, I think, but it can't be that important in the big scheme of things in terms of explaining crime trends overall. It's a one-off change in most states when it occurred. But I think the lead thing could be, but the childhood exposure to lead could be an important one. Should we take some more questions?
Steve, I've just got a couple from the internet.
Tweeted ones, okay.
Okay. Jorge Morales asks, how can we include the effects of organised crime in developing countries to the analysis of economic determinants of crime? And Ian B., who seems to be tweeting his very first tweet, do you think fewer young males would commit crime if it was viewed as uncool and unattractive?
Okay. So I've had to be necessarily selective. There's a big literature out there on organised crime, particularly in Italy, particularly focusing on mafia, the role of a mafia in lots and lots of different issues over time, in public procurement issues there as well. And so organised crime, and there's lots of organised crime in Latin America. There's lots of organised crime gangs around drugs in Latin America. So that's well beyond the scope of what I can talk about today. That would have to be a different lecture, I think. Would fewer young men, I guess you should say, would fewer young women do crime as well if it wasn't viewed as trendy or something? Is it viewed as trendy? I don't know. What do the young people in the room think about that one? Is that a good question or is that a bad question? Is it sensible? It's a good question. Okay. Is it true? What?
Perhaps you could say it's within the circles of the young males who commit crime rather than
Okay, that's the gender dimension. That wasn't quite what the tweeted question was about, though. That's controversial, I think, as well. Okay. Does anybody want to follow that one up? No? Should one? Was somebody up? Yeah, got somebody up there.
Today in Parliament, a Conservative MP suggested that we follow the lead of Portugal, Canada and Uruguay by legalising cannabis. But then the Prime Minister immediately rejected this. Who do you think is right?
Well, there's some good research on the decriminalisation in Portugal, which didn't seem to have any negative consequences at all. I think the US stuff and the Uruguay stuff is it's too early to tell. And the trouble in the US is the way that the discussion about drugs in general and the kind of opioid epidemic and the heroin substitutes available in lots of places that have really contaminated what you might think about a clean discussion about that there. But there's very good work about Portugal, which seems to suggest it had no negative consequences at all. Also, the use of cannabis didn't act as a gateway to future drug use has been studied a little bit there as well. But that's more controversial because, I mean, I'm not sure if that's an average argument. That might just be an argument in the tails of a distribution about whether it's a gateway or not. But I don't we have any, I mean, it's too recent to really figure it out from the US changes, I think.
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Thanks, Steve. Enjoyed the lecture very much. You've got some very convincing evidence that criminals respond very sharply to the types of incentives you've talked about. So I feel I've got to ask the question, what does this say about reintroducing the death penalty?
Okay. So as you well know, this is a massively studied area in the US, and it's very, very difficult to find robust evidence, largely because it's a small numbers issue in the empirical work that people have looked at. I'm going to have to cop out and say, of course, much of my talk about economic incentives is not going that far right down the distribution. And actually, I'm really talking about more marginal individuals, not so much about real hardcore offenders who may well be subject to the death penalty. Oh. Okay, we got any more questions? Here's one. Peter, how long have we got? Okay. Oh, just keep going. Okay.
Rebecca Rudd, teacher, and my question, well, first of all, I was fascinated by the economic returns of metal theft, and my question is, where do the criminals get their information from? Because they're so reactive to the prices of metals. Do they peruse the Financial Times? Are they hacking into the LME? Where do they get their information from?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, one of the quotes, I didn't talk about one of the quotes that's on here, which is sort of interesting. If I can just get back to them where they were. It's about the scrap metal dealers themselves. And one of the quotes here, the one second to the bottom, it says that the scrap metal industry has been told to clean up its act over thefts, the metal theft crime wave. Now, the scrap metal merchants know exactly what the prices are. And actually, it may well be that the people they're interacting with could be, you know, metal. The people go and sell the whatever they've stolen to the scrap metal merchants. It's actually true that the government has responded to this. So there was a Scrap Metal Act that was introduced in response to exactly this, which I haven't had time to talk about, which I've been working with various colleagues, he's here, one of them, on this. And actually, the crime comes down after the introduction of the Scrap Metal Act. But it used to be, if you got some copper pipe. So incidentally, Gary Becker he died a few years ago, but before he died, somebody was giving a seminar in Chicago, and he was telling about how somebody had stolen some copper pipes from his back garden, which I think is kind of, you know, exactly what we're testing in the Becker model here, moaning about somebody stealing some copper pipe from his back garden. So the scrap metal dealers may well have know what the prices are. I don't think it's actually so surprising to think that people would know what the value is. I mean, it's not going to be an instantaneous thing. They're not going to go and figure out, you know, but it's, I don't know, whatever it is, £500 per unit or whatever. But you'll see it going up over time, and people will get aware of that, I would have thought. I mean, the thing about the scrap metal dealers, apparently you used to be able to, if you did go and sell some stuff to a scrap metal dealer, you had to sign a book. But, you know, people would sign Mickey Mouse or something. But when the Scrap Metal Act was introduced, you now have to have a proof of identity with your address on it when you go and sell stuff to scrap metal dealers as well. So clearly there is some margin of knowledge of prices that might be transmitted there as well. But it doesn't surprise me. I mean, you know, if this is what you're doing, and you're figuring out that how much lead is worth off a church, and it's worth twice as much as it was 3 years ago. You know, that, on the margins, that's going to shift you compared to stealing a video recorder, where the price is falling, I think. Yeah. So. This is a tweet again.
If you want to take a hand first.
Was there one up there?
Yeah.
I can't see.
Becker talks about an economic cost to society through crime. I'm wondering, is a more formal version of crime, such as corruption or bribery, etc., or tax evasion, is that more detrimental to society rather than more petty forms of crime, such as robbery or even homicide?
Homicide's not very petty, is it? So the more serious response. So when the Home Office calculates the economic and social costs of crime, it does it by crime category. And so of course murder is extremely costly, but fairly infrequent. Whereas the other things you're talking about occur a lot, or reasonably, well, a lot more than murder, but are costed less. But the calculations of the social costs are pretty high. I mean, I don't know what the more recent literature on the size, there is a literature out there trying to calculate the size of tax evasion and say how much tax evasion is as a percentage of GDP. It's not quite my area, that, and so I don't quite know as much about that. I mean, I think the cross-country stuff has suggested that Britain's not as bad as other places, like Italy or something, where there's loads of tax evasion and going on and stuff as well, but it's a few. One here. Let's take this one here and one from Ramesh.
Okay, so we've sensibly probably sidestepped the death penalty question. Yeah. But what other policy implications do you perhaps foresee coming out of some of your research that you've done here?
Okay, so I think it was probably, in a big picture sense, I think it was two interesting things. It was the policies that are directly targeted at crime reduction and about the effectiveness of them. Then there's the other ones about whether there's actually, like the education policies, which were not designed with crime reduction in mind, but an unintended consequence of them is actually that crime reduction occurs. So I actually think designing policy, thinking in that kind of way about wider effects of different policies. I mean, you know, it would be good if different government departments were a bit more joined up on these different sorts of things to think about how the whole thing might play out in that kind of way. So I think it was the two, was the stuff directly about crime reduction, and then there's the unintended consequences ones as well. Have you got a tweet one?
Yeah, I think this is from Sunchicha Vujic, I think is your...
She's one of my co-authors. She's probably asking about the data or something. Yeah.
She says, can you say something about the potential negative relationship between activity on social media and risky behaviour among young people, including crime?
Did she ask that via Twitter?
I think, yeah, that's... She's having a laugh, basically, Steve.
I mean, it's difficult because we don't really have much evidence on that. I mean, the whole kind of cyber sphere is one of the unexplored areas that needs much more research being done, and I think there will be more research done on it in due course. But we don't know so much. We don't know so much about that. I don't think.
So you were talking about how 18 and 19-year-olds are more likely to commit crime than perhaps other people. So my question is, how do the economic incentives to commit crime vary between the age groups?
Well, I think you've got. That's a very good question. I mean, I was kind of making the general observation that. So if you look empirically at crime age profiles, for most crimes, not all crimes, and certainly you've got to abstract out the white-collar crimes and the fraud and the murder from this. But for most property crimes, and indeed most drug crimes, actually, the crime age profile peaks somewhere around about, it's inverse U-shaped, and it peaks somewhere around about 18, 19, 20 in most advanced countries, I think. The other thing on the other side of the equation when I presented the model, of course, life cycle earnings profiles. People enter the labour market at their lowest wage and then they go up. So of course people's earnings are lower at different ages. The difficult thing there, I think, is figuring out what the potential returns might be for people at different ages. And also, I think you've also got to kind of try and build in something that I also sidestepped. So I sidestepped the death penalty question a moment ago. But in my talk, I sidestepped the issue of gangs. I spoke about networks as I was going through this, but you may well get multiplier effects from gangs of young people, which we don't know anywhere near as much about as we would like to, I think. It's also true that the Becker model is perhaps less relevant to them. You probably do want the social networks, in social interactions type models as well. Yeah. Lights are really bright.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. My question is around the fact, so to what extent do you think that crime, particularly for example, petty robbery, reduces inequality within an economy, particularly considering like a Robin Hood effect, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor?
So there's been some work where people have tried to kind of figure out two dimensions of that. One of which is whether there is any relationship between crime and inequality across areas over time, for example. It's kind of hard to find much there. What seems to be much more important for crime across the income distribution is what happens to the bottom part. And that seems to be much more strongly correlated with crime than the top part. And so I think it's a bottom half or even bottom quarter of a distribution kind of issue that we might be thinking about there. I'm not sure there's much redistribution from petty robberies in a Robin Hood sense, though, if you think about the amount of money involved. But yeah. Got any more?
You say crime peaks at the age of around 18, but you only know the age of the people you catch.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe the older people are just smarter and not getting caught.
Yeah. Yes. So any measures of when you've got demographic characteristics, be they age, gender, race, of course, it's typically from arrests or convictions data or perhaps imprisonment data. So that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Hello.
Yep.
I wanted to talk about the economic incentives for redemption, perhaps. So, what ways can economics affect people who are already in crime come out of crime and stay on the straight and narrow?
So one thing we do know is recidivism rates are pretty high in this country, and so the likelihood of committing crimes having been locked away is pretty high, higher than in lots of other countries. So I think it's a very good question. So I tried to talk a little bit in a less direct way than you've just asked me when I spoke about the kind of career criminals and the prolific offenders and the dynamics of crime across the life cycle. One thing that from very small scale experiments but does seem to be useful is, so we know that prisoners, for example, have very low levels of human capital, maybe because they've consciously decided to not acquire levels of human capital. But literacy and numeracy programs in prison do seem to have a beneficial effect on recidivism rates when people leave prison. And so I think you need to think about kind of policies about rehabilitation and reintegration in that kind of way. Is that what you're asking me about? Yeah, okay. Should we have one last question? I'm getting dazzled by these lights. I should have worn my sunglasses. Okay, let's have a tweet one then to finish.
Is there an explanation, according to your model, why men tend to commit far more crime than women? Is it sexism in the crime world?
Okay. So now this is an area that is a feature of current research by people. Now there is actually convergence, gender convergence in crime rates. So whilst women traditionally have done much less crime, they're doing more now as a share of total crime than they used to in the past. And so there is some work that's been looking at that. So you see gender crime convergence from about the 1950s, 60s in lots of countries. So I've seen data from the US, Sweden, Australia, where you see gender crime convergence. It's typically that women are doing more property crimes rather than violent crimes. And they're very much closer on drug crimes as well. And so there is actually a narrowing of the male-female gap in terms of crimes, which may seem counterintuitive given that women are doing much better in terms of, women do much better in education now than they used to in the past relative to men. Women's wages have now narrowed as well. So actually there's a key question about whether the narrowing gender gap is because women are becoming more like men in their ability to be able to do crime, or whether there's an offsetting effect from the economic advantage, and that's not quite resolved yet. But there's stuff out there about the gender equality hypothesis in crime and explaining these patterns of convergence in crime by gender. Okay, are we done? Oh, he's going to do it.
Thank you very much. Just to finish off, and one important announcement, well, just to thank Steve again. I hope this has encouraged you all, not stimulated you to engage in crime, but to engage in the study of crime and the study of economics, and so on. And so thanks again to Steve. And a final announcement is that there is a reception afterwards to which you are all invited. I hope you'll find your way. Just follow the crowd. Okay, thank you.